A police captain slammed a 32-year-old nurse face-first onto her own living room floor while 6 officers tore her house apart. And she didn't fight back. Not because she couldn't, because she was waiting. 47 seconds later, 3 black military SUVs rolled onto the street in complete silence. The captain looked up from the woman he'd just pinned to the hardwood and watched the vehicles stop in a perfect perimeter around his entire operation. A man in a federal jacket climbed out of the lead vehicle, walked straight to the front door, and said 4 words that drained the color from Captain Roy Mercer's face entirely. Step away from her. Mercer had spent 14 years building a reputation for getting what he wanted. In the next 4 minutes, he would begin losing everything he'd ever taken. If this kind of story grips you, the ones where the person everyone underestimated turns out to be exactly who they should have feared, then follow this channel right now. Hit like and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go. The town of Callaway Bluff, Wyoming, had the particular stillness of a place that didn't expect much to happen. It sat in a wide valley framed by low ridgelines that turned purple at dusk, home to about 18,000 people, a handful of ag businesses, a casino 40 minutes east, and Hargrove Memorial Hospital, a regional trauma center that served the surrounding 4 counties and the stretches of interstate that cut through that part of the state. It wasn't a glamorous posting for a trauma nurse. The shifts were long, the staff was thin, and the cases that came through the ER doors were often the ugliest kinds. Trucking accidents, farm equipment injuries, overdoses, domestic violence that had gone too far before anyone called for help. Sarah Voss had taken the job at Hargrove Memorial 11 months ago, and in that time she had earned a reputation that most nurses spend a decade building. She was 32 years old, quiet in the way that efficient people tend to be quiet, and she moved through a resuscitation like she'd done it 1,000 times. Because she had. Not in a hospital. In places that didn't have hospitals. In places where the closest thing to an OR was a tarp strung between 2 vehicles and whatever trauma kit she could carry on her back. Her colleagues knew almost none of that. What they knew was that Sarah showed up early, stayed late, never complained about assignments, and had a stillness about her under pressure that some found reassuring and others found, quietly, unsettling. She was white, average height, with dark hair she kept pulled back during shifts, and a face that didn't give much away. She wasn't unfriendly, she just didn't volunteer things. Dr. Callum Oates, one of the senior ER physicians, once told a resident that Sarah Voss was the best trauma nurse he'd worked with in 22 years of emergency medicine. She sees things before they happen, he said. I don't know how, but she does. The resident had nodded, not sure what to do with that. Sarah had rented a house on the west edge of Callaway Bluff, a small 1-story on a gravel road set back from its neighbors by a stretch of yellowed grass and a line of cottonwoods that rattled in the wind. She kept the yard simple, no decorations. She had a truck, a dog named Ruger who was some kind of shepherd mix, and a stack of military history books on the shelf that she actually read. She cooked on weekends, ran in the mornings before dawn, and kept her life lean in the way that people do when they've learned that weight slows you down when it matters. On the Friday the raid happened, she had just come off a 12-hour shift. She'd spent the last 3 hours of it working a chest trauma. A 19-year-old kid who'd rolled his quad on a hillside and come in with bilateral pneumothorax and a BP that kept trying to die. The attending had gotten rattled. Sarah hadn't. She'd talked the resident through the needle decompression on the left side while managing the line on the right and monitoring the kid's CTs, and she'd done all of it without raising her voice once. The kid was in the ICU now, with a reasonable chance of making it. She'd driven home with the windows down, the cold air pulling some of the hospital smell off her, Ruger pacing the truck bed. She was in the kitchen, still in her scrubs, pulling together enough energy to make something to eat, when she heard the vehicles. Multiple engines. Too many for the street she lived on. She moved to the window by reflex, not urgency, and counted 3 patrol cruisers pulling to a stop in front of her house, plus a dark, unmarked unit that parked sideways across her driveway. Ruger, who'd been asleep on the porch, stood up and began a low, continuous growl. She didn't panic. She set down the glass she was holding, wiped her hands on a dish towel, and walked to the front door. She opened it before they knocked. Captain Roy Mercer was already on her porch, one hand raised to pound on the door. He was a big man, thick-necked, with a jaw that looked like it had been used as a battering ram, and the particular redness in the face that comes from years of high blood pressure or short temper, or both. He wore his uniform like it was body armor. Behind him, Sarah could see 5 officers spreading across her property, 2 of them moving toward the rear of the house. "Sarah Voss," Mercer said. "That's me." He held up a folded paper. "Search warrant. Step back." She took the warrant, opened it, read it. Took about 12 seconds. Then she looked up. "This address is wrong. You've got 4140 Tanner Road. I'm at 4410. Mercer didn't even blink. "Transposition doesn't void the warrant." "It might." She kept her voice flat, not confrontational. Informational. "You should verify before you proceed. I'm telling you right now, this is going to be a problem." "What's going to be a problem," Mercer said, stepping past her into the house without waiting for permission, "is you obstructing a lawful search. Step back." "You're making a mistake," she said. He turned around, looked at her with the expression men like him develop when they've never been wrong in a room they controlled. "Lady, I've heard that 100 times." "I'm sure you have." She stepped back. Let him in. What happened in the next 8 minutes would later be reconstructed from the body camera footage of Officer Dennis Haas, who was one of the 6 on scene that night and whose camera happened to be functioning correctly, unlike 3 others that would later show inexplicable gaps in their recordings. The officers moved through Sarah's house in the pattern of people executing a search with predetermined conclusions. They weren't looking carefully. They were looking hard, which is a different thing. Drawers pulled out and dropped. Shelves cleared, cushions cut. In the bedroom, 2 officers pulled her mattress off the frame and went through her closet with the kind of efficiency that suggested they were looking for something specific, not searching in good faith. Sarah stood in the living room and watched. She didn't move. She didn't protest each item. She tracked. Ruger was growling continuously from the porch, the sound pressing through the screen door. Mercer was in the kitchen, going through her cabinets, when Officer Haas's camera caught what happened next. Sarah had moved toward the hallway. She said later she was going to get her phone, which was on the charger in the bedroom. One of the officers, a younger man named Tate Buckler, who'd been with the department 14 months, stepped into the hallway and blocked her. When she stepped to the side, he grabbed her arm. What came next was quick and bad. She didn't resist in the way people resist. She didn't swing or struggle or yell. But when Buckler grabbed her arm, her body responded with the kind of reflexive counter-movement that gets trained into people through thousands of repetitions. And Buckler lost his grip in a way he hadn't expected. And then Mercer was coming through the kitchen doorway, and he had his hand on her shoulder, and then she was on the floor, face down, hands pulled back, with Mercer's knee in her back. "Don't move," Mercer said. His voice was perfectly controlled, which was somehow worse than if he'd been angry. Sarah's cheek was against the hardwood. She could see dust under the baseboard heater. She could feel the bruise forming on her collarbone where she'd gone down. She stayed completely still. "I'm going to say this one more time," she said. Her voice was level. Not the level of someone suppressing emotion, the level of someone who had already decided what was going to happen next. "You are making the biggest mistake of your career." Mercer laughed. It wasn't a cruel laugh. It was the laugh of a man who genuinely didn't believe her. That was the thing about men like Mercer. They weren't stupid exactly. They just couldn't imagine a world in which the person on the floor held cards they hadn't seen. He held her there for 2 minutes and 40 seconds while the search continued around her. Then the vehicles arrived. She felt the vibration through the floor before she heard them, a low, sustained frequency that wasn't consistent with standard vehicles on a gravel road. Then the sound reached her, multiple heavy engines, the crunch of tires, and something else, a specific organized stopping pattern that told anyone who'd spent time around military vehicle operations exactly what was happening. Ruger stopped growling. That was the thing that made Mercer lift his head. The dog had been growling for 8 straight minutes. The sudden silence was more alarming than the growling had been. Officer Haas went to the window. His camera caught what was outside. 3 black suburban-class SUVs with government plates positioned in a loose perimeter around the property. A 4th vehicle, a gray transit van with no markings, was parked across the mouth of the driveway. Men in dark jackets were deploying from the vehicles with the unhurried precision of people who had done this exact thing hundreds of times and were in no particular rush because they already controlled the situation. Mercer stood up off Sarah's back. She pushed herself off the floor without hurrying, stood, brushed the hair out of her face, looked at her hands for a moment, then looked at Mercer. He was staring out the window. "You might want to go outside," she said. "They'll come in if you don't." He went outside. Sarah stayed in the living room. She could hear the conversation through the open front door, which told her something about how the man in the federal jacket was choosing to conduct the exchange, loud enough for everyone on scene to hear. "Captain Mercer?" "That's right. Who are you?" "Special Agent Warren Falk, Defense Intelligence. I need you to stop what you're doing and hold every officer in place." A pause. "This is a county law enforcement operation under a valid— I've seen the warrant. The address discrepancy aside, we have a jurisdiction issue. The individual you have inside this property is covered under a federal protection classification. I need your officers out of that structure right now." "I don't know what that means." "I know you don't," Falk said. "That's the problem." What happened in the following 40 minutes happened quickly, and then slowly, and then quickly again. The way serious things tend to unfold. Falk came inside. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, lean, with the kind of face that didn't waste expression. He looked at Sarah the way a person looks at someone they've been briefed on, but are seen in 3 dimensions for the first time. "Ms. Voss? Agent Falk? You okay?" She rolled her collarbone experimentally. "I'll live." He nodded, looked at the state of the room, the overturned furniture, the split cushions, the cabinet doors hanging open. Something moved across his face briefly, and then it was gone. He was professional. He was also, she could tell, genuinely angry underneath it. "We need to talk," he said. "I figured." Outside, the county officers had been gathered into a loose group near the cruisers. 2 of Falk's people were moving through them quietly, collecting phones, not asking for them, not demanding them loudly, simply approaching each officer and holding out a hand, and the officers, reading the room, handing them over one at a time. Mercer was standing apart from his team, his arms crossed, his face doing the thing faces do when a person is assembling arguments. He watched his officers surrender their phones. He watched the federal agents begin photographing the scene inside Sarah's house. He watched a woman he'd pinned to the floor stand in her own kitchen and talk to a federal intelligence officer like she was the one running the conversation. He was starting to understand, in the slow, miserable way that men like him always understood things too late, that the ground under this situation was not what he'd thought it was. Inside, Falk had taken a seat at Sarah's kitchen table, the only seat at her kitchen table, since the other 2 chairs were currently in the living room where someone had moved them during the search. Sarah stood at the counter, arms loose at her sides. "How did you know?" she asked. She meant, how did they know to come tonight, to this address, at this exact time? "We've had a flag on anything involving your name and law enforcement contact. Goes back to your separation from service." He paused. "There are people who have an interest in making your life difficult." "I know that." "How long have you known?" She thought about it honestly. 6 months, maybe. Someone ran my plates in a parking lot at work, twice, a week apart. Then I started noticing other things, small things, the kind of things that aren't individually alarming but add up if you know what to look for. Falk was watching her carefully. "You didn't report it." "I didn't have enough to report." "You could have reached out to your contact." "My contact retired 14 months ago," she said. "I didn't have a replacement. I was managing it on my own." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, she could hear Mercer's voice, controlled but tight, talking to one of the federal agents. She couldn't make out the words. "The raid tonight," Falk said. "Where did it come from?" "I don't know the full chain, but the warrant was built on a tip that came through an anonymous source claiming I was in possession of stolen pharmaceutical supplies. I don't have stolen pharmaceutical supplies. I have 6 ibuprofen and a box of bandages." The tip originated from a burner, routed through 3 carriers. "We've already started the trace." He set his hands flat on the table. "Ms. Voss? Sarah, I need you to understand that this is not a routine compliance situation. What happened tonight was not about pharmaceutical theft. She looked at him. I know. Then you know we need to have a longer conversation. I know that too. That she'd left the army 3 years ago. Not dramatically, not with a public incident or a court-martial or anything that would have made the paperwork interesting. She'd served 2 combat deployments and part of a third, separated at the end of her contract with an honorable discharge and a set of credentials and a clearance she was no longer actively using. She'd come back to the United States, done her civilian nursing certification, applied for jobs, and ended up at Hargrove Memorial in a town small enough that nobody asked too many questions. That was the idea, anyway. The work she'd done in the Army was documented in her service record as combat medical specialist. What the service record didn't document, what service records are specifically designed not to document, was the nature of some of the operations she'd supported. The people she'd treated in the field weren't always active-duty military. Some of them were contractors. Some of those contractors were operating in areas and under authorities that occupied the gray space where official military operations ended and other things began. She had treated them the same as she treated everyone else, because that was what she did. A person in front of her who needed medical care got medical care. She didn't ask what they'd been doing when they got hurt. She just fixed them. But she saw things, and she remembered what she saw. That was the trouble with being good at trauma medicine. You paid close attention, and you retained detail, because detail was the difference between the right intervention and the wrong one. She'd noticed things about certain injuries that didn't add up. She'd seen documentation that passed through a field station that she hadn't been meant to see. She'd heard conversations she hadn't been meant to hear. She hadn't reported any of it when it happened. She hadn't been sure enough, hadn't understood what she was looking at, but she'd stored it, the way her mind stored everything, in the precise way she stored the sequence of a resuscitation or the dosage of a drug she might need in 6 months. 3 years later, sitting in her wrecked living room with a federal agent across the table and her shoulders starting to ache properly now that the adrenaline was settling, she understood that whatever she had stored was apparently important enough to someone that they'd arranged for a county police captain to put her face down on her own floor. The question was why now? She asked Falk that directly. He was quiet long enough that she knew the answer was something he was deciding whether to tell her. Then he said, someone else started talking about the same operation. Their account corroborated things we already suspected, and it pointed to the existence of at least one other witness who could provide additional detail. He paused. That other witness is you. Sarah absorbed that. Who's the first? I can't tell you that right now. Is the first one still alive? Falk looked at her steadily. Barely. The word landed in the room and sat there. She'd known, at some level, that this was where it was going, that the careful, invisible life she'd been building in Callaway Bluff, Wyoming, had a timer on it that she couldn't see. You couldn't carry what she was carrying and not understand that eventually it would have to go somewhere. You could delay the reckoning, or you could shape it, but you couldn't prevent it. She'd thought she had more time. What do you need from me? She said. Outside, Captain Roy Mercer was having a very different kind of conversation. Special Agent Falk had left 2 of his team members, both of them quiet, both of them politely immovable, to manage the county officers while he was inside. One of those agents, a woman named Torres, who looked like she was maybe 30 and had the particular blank attentiveness of someone who was recording every word even without visible equipment, had positioned herself near Mercer. She wasn't questioning him. She wasn't formally detaining him. She was simply present, which was somehow worse. Mercer had made 3 attempts to explain the warrant. Torres had listened to all 3 without expression. After the third, she said, Captain Mercer, I'm going to ask you to hold the explanation until we have a formal setting for it. Anything you say to me right now becomes part of the record. I'm not afraid of the record. I didn't say you should be. She looked at him mildly. I'm just giving you information. He fell silent. He watched his officers standing around the cruisers, some of them on their feet, a couple sitting on the hoods because nobody had told them not to, and it had been 40 minutes. He watched the federal agents going in and out of the house with equipment cases and evidence bags, and an air of focused efficiency that made his own team look like they'd shown up to the wrong event. He watched Officer Haas staring at the ground with the specific expression of a man who had realized some time ago, that tonight was going to follow him. Mercer had been a cop for 14 years. He'd been a captain for 3. He had accumulated in that time a particular immunity to accountability. The accumulated weight of small things never prosecuted, complaints never sustained, incidents filed away. He'd learned that the system had a tolerance for certain kinds of behavior, that the right relationships and the right paperwork could absorb almost anything. He was beginning to understand, standing on the gravel road outside Sarah Voss's house in the cold Wyoming night, that the system he'd learned to navigate was not the same system that had just parked 4 vehicles on his perimeter. Inside, Falk had one more thing to tell her. He said it carefully, the way you say things to someone when you need them to hear the whole sentence before they react to any part of it. "The anonymous tip that generated the warrant," he said. "We've started backtracking it. Preliminary indication is that it didn't originate locally." Sarah looked at him. "It came from a number that traces to a communications chain associated with a private contractor network." He paused. "The same contractor network connected to the operations you were present for overseas." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, Ruger had started pacing the porch. She could hear his nails on the boards, the restless back and forth of a dog who sensed something unresolved. "So it wasn't Mercer," she said. "He was just the instrument." "As far as we can tell, yes. Someone pointed him at you." "And Mercer didn't ask questions." Falk's expression was careful. "Mercer got a tip from someone he trusted. He ran with it the way he runs with things. Whether he understood what he was actually doing," he stopped. "That's something we'll establish." She stood and walked to the window. The federal agents were still working. 2 of her kitchen chairs were sitting on the porch for some reason. The cottonwoods at the edge of the property were moving in a wind she couldn't feel from inside. "This isn't going to stop," she said, "with or without what happened tonight." "No," Falk said. "It's not. That's why I'm here." She turned from the window, looked at him. "There's a man," he said slowly, "whose name is going to come up repeatedly as we go through this. A man who spent a career building things in the space between official operations and unofficial ones, who understood how to build cover, how to keep things quiet, how to make problems disappear." He paused. "Problems like witnesses. You know who he is. We've suspected for a while. We've been missing the connective tissue, the documentation that would put it together." He met her eyes. "We think you might have pieces of that." Sarah didn't answer right away. She thought about the things she'd stored, the documentation that had passed through the field station, the conversations, the faces of the men she'd treated and what those men had said, sometimes in the particular unguarded way that injured people talk when they're frightened and don't expect the woman fixing them to be paying close attention. She thought about the man she'd been, 3 years ago, who'd come back to the United States and built a small, quiet life, and tried to leave certain things in certain places. "You need me to remember," she said. "I need you to be willing to," Falk said. "There's a difference." She looked at him for a long moment. The kitchen was cold. Someone had left the back door open during the search, and the Wyoming night had come in and settled. "What happens to Mercer?" she said. "That depends on what his camera footage shows." 3 of his officers had cameras with gaps. Falk nodded slowly. "We know. One of them didn't. Haas. He had a functioning unit the whole time." She paused. "Make sure you pull that one first." Falk looked at her for a moment. Then he took out a notepad, an actual paper notepad, the kind that was harder to intercept than a digital device, and wrote something down. "Sarah," he said, without looking up, "who taught you to pay attention like that?" She thought of sand and heat and a tarp strung between 2 vehicles and the sound of someone trying to breathe through damage that shouldn't have been survivable. She thought of the long education of learning to notice things before they became catastrophes. "Experience," she said. Outside, one of the federal agents had approached Mercer again. This time, Torres was with her. Mercer's arms were still crossed, but his weight had shifted. The barely visible change in posture of a man who was no longer certain he was going to be driving away from this the way he'd driven in. Sarah watched him through the window. She thought, "You could have verified the address. You could have listened when I told you. You could have done about a dozen things differently tonight." She didn't feel contempt exactly. She felt something more precise than that. The specific clarity of someone who has watched a person walk into a consequence they built with their own hands. Falk's phone buzzed. He looked at it. Something shifted in his face. "What?" she said. He set the phone on the table so she could see the screen. A single line of text from a number she didn't recognize. He knows about Falk. Meeting was flagged. They'll move tonight. She read it twice. "Who sent that?" she said. Falk was already standing up, already reaching toward the window to signal Torres. "Our first witness," he said. "The one who's barely alive." He looked at her. "He's trying to warn us." Ruger barked. Sharp, urgent, a sound different from the earlier growling. Not the bark of a dog responding to general agitation. The bark of a dog who'd heard something specific. Sarah was already moving toward the back of the house before Falk finished the sentence. The cottonwoods at the edge of the property were still. They had been moving 5 minutes ago. They weren't moving now. The cottonwoods weren't moving because something was standing in them. Sarah didn't stop to explain that to Falk. She moved low and fast through the hallway, past the bedroom where the mattress still sat sideways off the frame, to the narrow utility room at the back of the house, where she kept her gear in a locked cabinet she'd bolted to the wall. Studs herself. First week she moved in. She had the combination open in 4 seconds. The cabinet held what it always held: a trauma kit, a go bag with 48 hours of supplies, a change of clothes, her documentation in a waterproof sleeve, and a legally registered handgun she hadn't needed in 11 months. She took the gun. She took the go bag strap in her left hand and slung it without breaking stride. Falk was in the hallway behind her, already on his radio in a tone that was quiet and very fast. She caught fragments: perimeter, east tree line, unknown number. And then she was at the back door and she stopped there. Didn't open it. Stood to the side of the frame instead and looked through the small window set into the door at an angle that let her see the yard without putting herself in front of the glass. The yard was dark. Her porch light was on a timer and had clicked off at 10, which had been 45 minutes ago. The nearest streetlight was on the road in front, which meant the back of the property operated in whatever light came from the sky, and tonight the sky was overcast and there wasn't much. She counted 3 shapes at the tree line. Maybe 4. They were good. They weren't moving, weren't outlined against anything, were using the trunks correctly. But Ruger was facing exactly where they were, every hair on his back upright, his body rigid in the way that meant he'd been tracking them for longer than she'd been looking. She stepped back. Falk was beside her now. 3 in the tree line, she said quietly. East side. Possibly a 4th. They've been there a while. How do you know they've been there a while? Because my dog knew before I did, and he's been agitated for 20 minutes. She looked at him. Your people on the perimeter didn't catch them. Falk's jaw tightened briefly. My people are covering the roadside. Then someone planned for that. He got back on the radio. While he did, Sarah ran through what she had. The gun, the go bag, a utility room with no second exit, a back door that opened outward onto a wooden porch with 2 steps, and then open yard between her and the tree line, approximately 40 meters to the trees. In full dark, with people who knew what they were doing, 40 meters was a long way to be wrong about something. Falk came off the radio. I've got 2 agents repositioning to the east perimeter. ETA 90 seconds. Tell them not to use lights. He looked at her. If they use lights, she said, whoever's in those trees knows exactly where they are before they get there. Tell them to come dark and wide. Flank from the north side of the property, not the east. He relayed that without comment. Then he looked at her with something that wasn't quite surprise and wasn't quite assessment, something in between, the look of a person revising a picture they'd had in their head. The tip that came in, he said, keeping his voice down. It said they'll move tonight. Present tense. Our first witness sent that less than 12 minutes ago. Meaning they already knew about the meeting before it happened. Meaning someone inside has been feeding information upstream since before we arrived here. He paused. We have a problem. I know. She was still watching the back window. The problem is you don't know which of your people it is. The silence that followed that sentence was the particular silence of someone not denying something they couldn't deny. Can you get me out of here? She said. Working on it. That's not a yes. No, he said. It's not. Man, The next 11 minutes were the kind of minutes that stretch. Falk worked his radio in short, controlled bursts while Sarah stayed beside the back door window and tracked what she could see in the yard. Ruger had gone silent, which she understood. He'd learned, the same way she'd learned, that there were situations where noise was a liability. He was pressed against the side of the porch railing now, watching the tree line the way she was watching it, both of them waiting. The two federal agents came from the north side of the property, the way she'd told Falk to tell them to. Wide, dark, no lights, moving at a crouch along the property fence line. She watched them through the window and felt something loosen slightly in her chest. They were good. They moved like people who'd trained for this and taken the training seriously. They reached the east side of the yard and stopped, communicating with each other through signals she couldn't see from this distance. Then one of them came back on Falk's radio. The voice was controlled but tight. Two individuals confirmed in the tree line, armed. They made us on approach. They're pulling back west. Let them go, Falk said. Don't pursue. A pause on the radio. Copy. He looked at Sarah. They were watching the house, observing, not moving. Not yet, she said. You think there are more? I think two people don't get sent to the back tree line without something in front. She looked toward the hallway that led to the living room and the front of the house. What's happening with Mercer's officers? Falk got on the radio again. Torres's voice came back 30 seconds later. Mercer's people are staged by the cruisers. No issues, but a slight pause. Captain Mercer is not with them. Falk looked at Sarah. How long? He said into the radio. Torres says she saw him about 7 minutes ago. He said he needed to make a call. She assumed he stayed in I-line. She lost track. 7 minutes was enough time to walk 2 blocks in any direction. It was enough time to make a call to someone who wasn't law enforcement. It was enough time to give someone a very specific update on the interior layout of a house you'd just spent 8 minutes searching. He's not corrupt, Sarah said, thinking out loud, working it. He's just manageable. Someone told him something that made this raid feel legitimate. He did it because he wanted to, because it fit a pattern he already had. But they knew how he operated. They knew he'd give them what they needed. Access, Falk said, and information. He saw the interior. He saw where the exits were. He didn't know he was doing reconnaissance, but he was. She pulled the go-bag strap tighter on her shoulder. We need to move. Not tomorrow. Not in an hour. Right now. They went out the front. Not because the front was safer, but because whoever was positioned in the back was already pulling away, which meant the visible exit had become the less exposed one, at least for the next few minutes. Falk had his remaining agents pull 2 of the SUVs up tight to the front porch, doors open, creating a physical corridor from the front door to the vehicle. It wasn't elegant, it was fast, and it was functional. And Sarah had been in enough situations to know that fast and functional was what you needed when elegant wasn't available. She got into the second SUV with Falk. The agent driving was named Morales. She got that from the brief exchange between him and Falk in the driveway, and he had the engine running before they'd fully closed the doors. Ruger. She'd left Ruger. Wait, she said. Falk started to say something. 1 second, she said, and she was already back out of the vehicle before he could argue. She whistled once, short, specific, the signal she'd trained him to over 3 years, and Ruger came off the porch and hit the ground running. He made it to the SUV in about 4 seconds. She got him in, got herself in, pulled the door shut. Morales was already moving before she was fully seated. Falk said nothing about the 30-second delay. She got the impression he filed it away the same way she filed things away. Not judging it, just noting it, updating his picture. They drove east, which she noted, away from the direction the figures in the tree line had retreated. Smart. 2 other vehicles went west and north, which was probably misdirection, probably decoys, probably also extraction cover for the county officers who still needed to be processed and documented before anyone went home. She didn't ask. She watched the road. Where are we going? She said. Safe house, Falk said. 40 minutes out. Whose? Ours. She thought about the text message. He knows about Falk. Meeting was flagged. Is there anyone at the safe house right now who knew about tonight's meeting in advance? Falk looked at her for a moment. I need you to let me do my job. I'm asking a specific question, and I'm telling you we've already gone through the access list. That's not what I asked. He was quiet, then, we'll do a secondary verification when we arrive. She took that as the closest thing to an honest answer she was going to get and let it go. Outside the window, Callaway Bluff thinned and disappeared, and the Wyoming landscape opened up around them in the dark, wide and flat and indifferent, the kind of terrain that made you feel both exposed and invisible at once. She knew this road. She'd driven it in the early mornings when she went out before dawn. It felt different at speed in a federal vehicle, different with a go-bag at her feet, and the memory of a knee in her back and the knowledge that two people had been standing in her tree line with weapons. She leaned her head back against the seat. Her shoulder was going to be a real problem by morning. She could already feel the joint stiffening. She did a quiet inventory of the rest of herself. The bruise on her collarbone, a scrape on her right palm she hadn't noticed getting, the general jarred feeling of a body that had been put on the floor harder than it should have been. She'd had worse. That wasn't comfort exactly, but it was context. "Tell me about the first witness," she said. "I can't do that yet." "You said barely alive." "Yes. That means critical, meaning whatever they had or knew, they may not be able to deliver it themselves." She looked at him. "Which means what they said to you before they ended up barely alive is what you're working from, and that's why you need me." Falk looked out the windshield. "You should get some sleep." "I'm not tired." "You should still try." She understood that to mean, there is information I will give you, but not in a vehicle with a driver who also has clearance, because I don't know right now who I trust and I am being careful. She understood it, and she respected it, and she closed her eyes and didn't sleep. The safe house was a working property, a ranch spread that someone was actually running or convincingly pretending to run. There were animals. She heard them when they pulled in, the low sounds of cattle somewhere beyond the main structures. The main house was dark, which was right. Two figures on the porch stepped into the headlights briefly, identified themselves to Morales, and stepped back. The whole entry took about 90 seconds. Inside, the house was clean and functional, and had the particular impersonal quality of a space maintained for use rather than lived in. Someone had coffee going. She didn't know if that was tactical consideration or just habit, but she was grateful for it either way. Falk disappeared for 20 minutes. She drank the coffee and sat at a table in the kitchen and let Ruger settle under her feet, his weight against her ankles the specific comfort it always was. And she did what she always did in the space between crises. She organized. Not physically. She didn't have much to organize physically. She organized what she knew and what she didn't know and what she needed to find out, arranging the information the way she arranged a complex resuscitation, identifying what was critical, what was urgent, what was important but could wait, what was noise. What she knew, someone had directed a corrupt adjacent police captain toward her house using a fabricated tip. That tip had originated from a communications chain connected to a contractor network she'd encountered overseas. A federal intelligence witness with information about the same network was currently hospitalized in critical condition. Someone inside the federal operation had access to information about tonight's meeting. The people in her tree line had been watching, not breaching, which meant they wanted information about her movements more than they wanted her stopped immediately. What she didn't know, who was at the top of this. What specific information she was supposed to have that they wanted suppressed, what the first witness had told Falk before ending up barely alive. Whether whoever was feeding information upstream was still in a position to do it. What she needed to find out, all of it, but in the right order. Falk came back. He looked like he'd had an argument, or a very difficult phone call, or both. He sat down across from her and put his hands on the table. "We have a name," he said. "The name our first witness gave us before their condition deteriorated." He paused. "Retired Colonel, Philip Darrow." She turned the name over, searched her memory the way she searched a chart, systematically, not frantically. Philip Darrow. She'd never heard the name, but then, names in that world were often the last thing you learned. You learned faces, voices, patterns of behavior. Names came later, if at all. "The operation you supported," Falk said. "Third deployment, the field station at the Northeast Post." She went still. You know what I'm referring to. Yes, she said. The contractors you treated there, 5 individuals over a period of about 9 weeks, one of whom had a specific injury profile that you documented. She remembered the injury. She remembered it very specifically because it hadn't made sense. The wound pattern was consistent with an event that the man's own account couldn't explain, not because he was lying badly, but because the cover story he'd been given hadn't accounted for the particular physics of what had actually happened to him. She'd noted it in her documentation because that was what she did. She documented what she observed. She'd assumed at the time it would be absorbed into the larger record and mean nothing. The documentation, she said. Is it still in the system? Parts have been removed. Which parts? The injury notation, the wound description, the date and time of treatment. He met her eyes. Not the patient's intake information, not your name as treating clinician. She understood. They'd tried to erase the record, but they'd done it unevenly. Her name was still connected to a treatment record that no longer fully existed, which meant anyone pulling that record could see she'd been there, could see she'd documented something. They just couldn't see what anymore, which made her a loose thread in a very deliberate way. Darrow, she said. He oversaw contractor operations in that region. He signed the authorizations for the field station, for the operations those contractors were supporting, and for us, based on what our first witness told us, for a specific event that those operations enabled, a civilian event. He said the last 2 words with a particular flatness. 23 people. She didn't say anything. The contractors you treated were injured during the cover-up operation, Falk said, not the original event, the cleanup. She sat with that for a moment. She'd treated men who'd been hurt covering up the deaths of 23 people. They'd come to her bleeding, and she'd fixed them, and she hadn't known. I treated them well, she said, not defensively, just as a fact she needed to say out loud. I know. I would have treated them exactly the same if I'd known. I know that too. He paused. Sarah, the injury documentation you made, even in the form that still exists, even with the content stripped, it establishes a timeline. It puts specific individuals at a specific location during a specific window. Combined with what the first witness told us, it provides corroboration of a chain of authorization that goes up to Darrow. He leaned forward slightly. You are not just a witness. You're a corroborating record. That's why they want you managed. She looked at her coffee cup. The coffee had gone cold while she wasn't paying attention. Managed, she said. The raid tonight was a first attempt, a soft one, relative to what they're capable of. The idea was probably to discredit you, get a criminal record attached to your name, complicate your credibility as a future witness. When that fell apart because we moved faster than they expected, he stopped. The people in the trees, she said, were gathering information. Yes, about the current situation, so they can decide what comes next. She sat back. Ruger shifted under her feet, resettled, exhaled in that deep way dogs do when they're not alarmed but they're watching. You said you needed me to be willing to remember, she said. I need you to be specific. What exactly do you need, and how do you need me to provide it? Falk reached into the bag he'd brought in from the vehicle and placed a folder on the table. Not a digital file. Paper. The cover was blank. Sworn statement. Comprehensive. Everything you observed during your 3 deployments, with particular focus on the Northeast Post. Every patient you treated in that window, every conversation you heard, every document that passed through your field station. He tapped the folder. We need it in a form that can be used, not informally, on the record, which means I become a target in a way I can't walk away from. Yes. She put her hand on the folder. Didn't open it yet, just held it. Philip Darrow, she said. Tell me about him. Falk looked at her. He spent 30 years building something that operates in the spaces no one officially supervises. He's disciplined, he's patient, and he has people in a lot of places. The kind of places that can make things very difficult for individuals who create problems for him. How many people has he made disappear? We don't know the full number. Best estimate. 7 individuals with connections to operations he oversaw have died in situations that were ruled accidents or natural causes over the past decade. He paused. 2 others have been institutionalized following what were described as mental health crises. She absorbed that. 9 people, across 10 years, patient and disciplined. And the first witness, she said, how did they end up, Her phone buzzed. She'd set it on the table when they'd arrived. She looked at the screen. Unknown number. But not entirely unknown. The prefix, the pattern of digits, was one she recognized from a very specific context, a context that had been closed 3 years ago. She picked up the phone. Don't answer that, Falk said sharply. She answered it. The voice on the other end was male, older, with the particular cadence of someone who learned to speak in institutional settings. The measured pace, the precision of word selection. You don't know me, the voice said, but I know what you treated and what you saw and what you wrote down, and I know something Falk hasn't told you yet. A pause. I know what happened to the nurse who treated the same contractor 2 weeks before you did, the one whose name you never knew. Sarah felt something move through her that wasn't exactly fear. It was more specific than fear. It was the feeling of a floor dropping away, the sensation of a situation revealing itself to be much larger than the room you thought you were in. Who is this? She said. Someone who made the same choices you made and lived with them longer. The voice was steady, but underneath the steadiness there was something strained, something running on reserve. I'm the one who sent the message tonight. I'm the one who's barely alive. A pause. And I'm calling you because Darrow has someone inside that house with you right now. Sarah didn't look at Falk when the voice said it. She looked at the table. Her mind did what it did under pressure, and it narrowed, cut out everything peripheral, and ran the variables. There were 4 people inside the house. Falk, Morales, a second agent named Bright, who'd been at the door when they arrived, and herself. The caller had sent the warning text 40 minutes ago, which meant he'd had knowledge of the meeting before it happened. He'd also known Falk's name specifically, which narrowed the source of the leak to someone with operational awareness, not just logistical access. How do you know? She said into the phone. Quiet. Flat. Because I was read into the operational security structure for tonight's extraction, before I ended up where I am. A pause. She could hear the effort in his breathing, the specific labor of someone managing pain on top of conversation. There were 4 people with access to the safe house location. I was one. Falk was one. The other 2 were assigned to field support. Another pause. One of them has a secondary communication channel that's been active since 0200. Which one? Bright. She still didn't look at Falk. She set the phone on the table face up, speaker on, and then she looked at Falk and kept her voice completely even. Get Morales in here, right now. Tell him it's routine. Falk read her face. He didn't ask. He stood up and went to the hallway door and called for Morales in a tone that matched what she'd asked for. Casual, unremarkable. While he did that, she spoke into the phone. Where are you? St. Anselm Regional, Harlow, Utah. The breathing again. I checked myself in under a different name 3 days ago. The attending thinks I have pneumonia. A short exhale that might have been a tired laugh. I have 2 fractured ribs and a punctured lung from a car that hit me in a parking garage. The pneumonia part they figured out on their own. Morales came through the door. Falk was behind him. She looked at Morales and said, Where's Bright? Morales' expression shifted slightly. Not guilt, something more subtle. Recalculation. Outside. Running perimeter check. When did he go out? Maybe 10 minutes ago. 10 minutes was after they'd arrived. After Falk had told Bright the safe house location in the vehicle, which meant Bright hadn't passed the location before arrival. He'd passed it after, which meant the people outside her house had needed to relocate. They needed time to set up. We need to move, she said. She said it to Falk, clearly, loud enough for the phone to pick it up. The voice said, Yes, now. Falk was already processing. She could see him working it. The discomfort of a man who ran operations and was discovering mid-operation that the structure he'd trusted had a hole in it. He didn't argue. He looked at Morales. Get the vehicle running. South exit, not the way we came in. Morales left. She picked up the phone. I need a way to reach you. You don't, the voice said. I'm going to be moved in the next hour. Falk knows the protocol for secure medical contact. A pause. There's something else. The folder he gave you. She looked at the folder on the table. The sworn statement, the voice said. It matters. But it won't be enough on its own. Darrow's legal structure is built to absorb testimony. What breaks it is the physical record, the intake documentation from the Northeast Post, specifically the contractor intake logs from weeks 7 and 8 of your deployment cycle. Those logs have his authorization signature on them, not a subordinate, him. The breathing was getting worse. She could hear it deteriorating even across a phone connection. Darrow signed those authorizations personally because he didn't trust anyone else with the operational specifics. That was his mistake. Where are the logs? A short silence. That's what I've been trying to find out for 2 years. Stopped. She could hear something in the background. A monitor. The particular rhythmic sound of a hospital room. The copies that should be in the Federal Archive are gone. Removed. But medical records have redundancy that military records don't because of liability structure. There's a secondary archive. Field station medical records from that deployment cycle were duplicated to a civilian contractor database for insurance compliance. He took a slow, careful breath. Falk knows which contractor. He has a subpoena already drafted. He's been waiting for a cooperating witness to make it viable. She looked at Falk. Is that true? Falk said, yes. How long have you had it drafted? 6 weeks. And you didn't move on it because without corroboration, without someone who could authenticate the records and establish what they documented, Darrow's lawyers would have them suppressed in 48 hours. We needed a witness first. He paused. We needed you specifically because you're the treating clinician of record. You can authenticate. The phone. She brought it back up. Are you still there? The breathing, then, still here. A pause. I'm sorry I couldn't come to you better than this. I had a plan that was considerably less chaotic. She didn't know this man. She knew his voice, his breathing pattern, the particular texture of someone running on whatever reserve is left when everything else is used up. She said the only thing there was to say. You warned us. That matters. Get the records, he said. Before Darrow does. The call ended. The south exit was a farm road that ran behind the property through a cattle gate and then connected to a county road 2 miles east. Morales had the vehicle running. Falk was moving through the house in the specific fast, quiet way of someone conducting a timed exit, pulling what needed to come with them and leaving everything else. Sarah had her go-bag already. She had the folder. She had the phone. She thought about Bright for approximately 4 seconds. Where he was, whether he knew they were leaving, what he'd do when he figured it out. Then she decided that was Falk's problem in the immediate term and her problem in the longer term, and right now neither of them had the luxury of managing it beyond the exit. She got Ruger. She got in the vehicle. They were through the cattle gate in under 3 minutes from the end of the call. Morales drove without lights for the first half mile, which was uncomfortable and slow and correct. When they hit the county road, he clicked the headlights on and drove at a pace that was fast without being conspicuous. The particular discipline of someone who understood that a vehicle doing 90 on a county road at 2 in the morning was its own kind of signal flare. Falk was on the phone, a different phone than before, a handset he'd pulled from the bag, not his personal unit. He spoke in short bursts and listened more than he talked, which told her the conversation was coming from above him rather than going to someone below. She sat in the back with Ruger's head on her knee and the folder in her lap, and her shoulder throbbing in a way that she was going to have to address before it became a genuine mobility problem. She unzipped the side pocket of the go-bag and found the small medical kit she always packed and took 400 milligrams of ibuprofen dry because there was no water immediately available. And she did a careful range of motion check on the shoulder. Nothing torn, probably a deep contusion to the posterior deltoid where she'd gone down. Possible minor subluxation that had already partially reduced on its own. She'd had worse. She'd also made worse injuries worse by ignoring them, so she noted it and filed it in the category of things requiring management within the next 12 hours. Falk ended the call. He turned around in the front seat to look at her. St. Anselm Regional, he said. Harlow, Utah. That's our first witness. I know. He told me. He told you more than he's told us in 3 weeks of trying to reach him through secure channels? Something moved across Falk's face. It might have been frustration, or it might have been the particular thing that happens to careful people when they realize that the careful structures they've built are less reliable than a direct phone call between two people who don't know each other. He trusts you. He trusts what I represent, she said. There's a difference. Maybe, he paused. The contractor database, the insurance compliance archive. I have the subpoena for Harman Verity Group. That's the contractor who managed field station logistics for your deployment cycle. Their insurance compliance records would include duplicated medical intake forms. Harman Verity, she repeated. Searched it. Nothing came back. Not the name itself, but that wasn't surprising. Logistics contractors in that world operated under names that were designed to be unremarkable. They're still operating? Restructured twice since your deployment. Currently operating as Verity Consolidated Services out of Denver. Same ownership structure underneath. Different letterhead. He paused. The subpoena was drafted 6 weeks ago. I've been holding it because serving it without a cooperating witness in hand would have tipped Darrow's network before we were ready. Darrow has someone inside Verity Consolidated. Almost certainly. So when we serve it, they'll know. Yes, which means we serve it and pull the records simultaneously, not sequentially. We can't serve notice and then wait for compliance. We need the physical records in federal custody before Darrow's people can touch them. He looked at her steadily. Which means we need a federal magistrate to authorize emergency custodial seizure, not just a standard subpoena response. How long does that take? If I wake up the right person tonight? 3 to 4 hours. She looked out the window. Dark road, dark plains, the occasional light of a distant structure. Do it, she said. They drove to a staging location outside a small city called Merritt, 40 miles from the Utah border. A commercial property, an actual office building that someone was actively using for other purposes during business hours, and that happened to have a secure room in the basement that had been there for considerably longer than the current tenant. Falk used it with the particular familiarity of someone returning to a place he'd been before. The secure room had a table, 4 chairs, a dedicated communication setup, and a coffee maker that was better than the one at the ranch. She made coffee because nobody else was doing it, and it needed to happen, and she sat down with the folder and opened it and started reading. The sworn statement template was thorough. 11 pages of structured prompts, dates, locations, individuals encountered, documentation handled, conversations witnessed. It wasn't a deposition, it was a pre-deposition evidentiary framework, the kind of instrument that got used when investigators were building towards something large and needed to establish the scaffolding correctly before the formal legal process began. She read it twice. Then she picked up the pen Falk had left on the table and started writing. She wasn't a writer in any particular sense, but she'd spent years writing clinical documentation under conditions that didn't allow for uncertainty or imprecision, and that training transferred. She wrote the way she documented a trauma assessment, observation, chronology, specificity. Not interpretation, not inference. What she had seen, heard, handled, and recorded, in the order she had seen, heard, handled, and recorded it. Falk came and went. Morales was somewhere above them in the building. She didn't track them. She wrote. The 7th week of her 3rd deployment. The Northeast Post, which had been a converted agricultural structure 40 kilometers from the nearest coalition installation. She'd been assigned there on a 6-week rotation to provide medical support for what had been described as a security contractor team conducting infrastructure assessment. She had never, in 6 weeks, seen anyone conduct infrastructure assessment. She had treated injuries, managed medications, maintained a medical log, and kept her observations to herself because her job was medical, not operational. She wrote the contractor's name, the one with the injury that hadn't made sense. She wrote the injury description. Entry wound inconsistent with the patient's account of the event, wound track suggesting a distance and angle incompatible with the scenario described, tissue damage profile consistent with a high-velocity round at closer range than the patient's story allowed for. She wrote that she had documented it as observed, had flagged it to the duty officer, and had received no response. She wrote what the duty officer had said to her the following morning. You wrote what you saw. That's enough. Don't add to it. She wrote the conversation she'd overheard. Not eavesdropped, overheard, because the post was a converted agricultural structure with no meaningful acoustic separation between the treatment area and the adjacent room, and people in that adjacent room had conducted conversations that they'd either not realized she could hear or had decided didn't matter because she was just the medic. She was always just the medic. She wrote down names, dates, specific phrases. The particular phrase that had stayed with her for 3 years. The authorization goes to the top of the chain, and the top of the chain is covered. The only exposure is documentation, and documentation can be managed. She'd heard that sentence and filed it and not known what to do with it. Now she knew. She wrote for 2 hours without stopping. When she finished, her hand ached and the coffee was cold, and Falk was standing in the doorway with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled up and the particular look of someone who had been having difficult phone calls. Magistrate signed the emergency order, he said. We serve Verity Consolidated at 0600 when their Denver office opens. Federal marshals go in simultaneously with the service. That's 4 hours. Yes. A lot can happen in 4 hours. I know. He paused. Bright is in custody. He was picked up 20 minutes ago on the property road. He'd made 2 outbound calls after we left. He came into the room and sat down across from her. We don't know what he communicated or to whom. We're working on it. She slid the completed statement across the table. 11 pages, both sides, in her precise clinical handwriting. Falk picked it up, read the first page, turned to the second. By the 4th page, he'd stopped moving. The kind of stillness that happens when a person is absorbing something that confirms what they suspected, but is more specific than they'd hoped. He read all 11 pages without speaking. When he put it down, he said, The phrase about documentation being managed, you're confident in that? I don't write things down that I'm not confident in. Who said it? She told him the name. He wrote it down. His expression didn't change, which meant it was a name he already had, and that it connected to something above where he'd currently placed it. Darrow's operations officer, Falk said quietly. From that period. Is he still accessible? He died 14 months ago. Car accident. A pause. The 4th and 9. She put her hands flat on the table. Thought about the voice on the phone, the man with the fractured ribs and the punctured lung who'd been in a parking garage in the wrong place. The 4th and 9. How did our first witness avoid being the 5th? By being harder to find than they expected. Falk folded his hands. He moved 9 times in 2 years, changed his name twice. He reached out to us 3 months ago through a channel that took 6 weeks to verify. He paused. His name is Garrett Lund. He was a logistics coordinator for Harmon Verity during your deployment cycle. He was present at the Northeast Post during weeks 6 through 9. She searched the name. It didn't surface anything, but she searched the weeks, the position. Logistics coordinator, present at the post. Someone who would have handled the documentation flows. Someone who would have known what was being removed and by whose order. He signed for things, she said, incoming and outgoing. Yes. Including documentation transfers. Yes. So his signature is on the transfer records for anything that was removed from the post-medical archive. Falk nodded slowly. Which is why he's been in a parking garage and then a hospital room under a false name for the last 3 weeks. He has direct evidence of the removal. He can establish chain of custody for what was taken. He paused. Combined with your statement and the Verity Consolidated records, we have 3 independent evidentiary threads converging on the same authorization chain. She thought about that. 3 threads, 3 sources, enough to build something that Darrow's lawyers couldn't simply suppress or discredit one piece at a time. He needs to stay alive until 600, she said. His security at St. Anselm is our people. People Bright didn't have access to. Are you sure? He looked at her. No, he said honestly. I'm not entirely sure of anything right now. That's the accurate answer. She appreciated the accuracy even though it was the worst possible thing to hear. She stood up, rolled her shoulder carefully, hissed slightly at the specific pain of it. I need to make a call, she said. To the hospital. Falk frowned. To Lund? To the attending physician. She looked at him. You said he has fractured ribs and a punctured lung. If his condition is deteriorating, his window for giving any kind of formal testimony narrows very quickly. I need to talk to the attending and get an accurate picture of where he is medically. She paused. I'm a trauma nurse. I know what questions to ask and what the answers mean. Do you? A moment. Then he slid his phone across the table. She made the call, got the attending on the fourth try, a tired-sounding physician named Dr. Rice, who was not particularly interested in discussing a patient with a caller she didn't know at 3 a.m. until Falk took the phone briefly, said 4 sentences, and handed it back. After that, Dr. Rice was cooperative. What she told Sarah took about 6 minutes and landed in Sarah's chest like a stone. Garrett Lund's punctured lung had been managed with a chest tube placed 2 days ago, which was correct, but the chest tube had begun showing signs of complications within the last 18 hours, output increasing, which indicated either re-expansion failure or a secondary bleed. His oxygen saturation was holding but trending. His fever had been persistent for 36 hours. There was a real possibility, Dr. Rice said carefully, that he would require surgical intervention within the next 24 hours. Has he been lucid? Sarah asked. Intermittently, he's on pain management that affects his clarity. How lucid specifically in the last 4 hours? A pause. He was awake and coherent at 100 hours. He asked to use a phone. I allowed it because his vitals were stable enough and he was insistent. After he made that call, how were his vitals? Another pause. Elevated. His heart rate went up and his pressure increased. She closed her eyes briefly. The call to her phone. He'd known, making that call, that it would cost him something physically. He'd made it anyway. Dr. Rice, she said, if he deteriorates in the next 4 hours, if he needs intervention, I need to know immediately. Please make sure whoever is providing security for that room has a direct line to this number. She read out Falk's number from the handset. Do not let anyone move him without federal authorization. Is he in danger? She thought about the answer, about the 4 vehicles on her property. The figure in the tree line, the man who'd been hit by a car in a parking garage, the 5th in 9. Yes, she said. Please treat the situation accordingly. She ended the call and handed the phone back to Falk. He's declining, she said, slowly but declining. We need the Verity records at 0600, and we need Lund's formal statement before his condition requires surgery because post-surgical recovery is going to affect his legal availability, and Darrow's lawyers will use every hour of that. Understood. Falk was already composing something on the secure line. I'm requesting that the marshals be on site at Verity 30 minutes early, and I'm getting a federal court recorder dispatched to St. Anselm tonight for an emergency deposition if Lund is willing. He'll be willing, she said. Falk looked at her. You sound certain. A man who made a phone call from a hospital bed that raised his heart rate and his blood pressure because he needed to warn someone he'd never met. She paused. He's willing. The secure communications unit on the table chirped. Falk picked it up, listened. His face did the thing she'd started to recognize. The controlled shift of expression that meant incoming information was bad, but not catastrophic, and he was deciding how to carry it. He set the unit down. The 2 outbound calls Bright made, Falk said. We pulled the numbers from the cell intercept. One was a burner that's already cold. He paused. The other was a registered number. It belongs to a private security firm based in Colorado Springs. She waited. The same firm, he said slowly, that currently has a contract providing transportation and logistics support for... He stopped. She watched him. For St. Anselm Regional Hospital, he finished. The room went very quiet. Sarah stood up from the table and was already moving before the next sentence formed, the go-bag coming off the chair, her hand finding the gun at her hip, and Ruger lifting his head from the floor with his ears forward. Falk's phone, the secure handset, rang. He answered it, listened for 4 seconds. The color left his face in a way she had not seen from him before. What? She said. Someone just cut the power to the East Wing of St. Anselm Regional. The East Wing of St. Anselm Regional housed, among other things, the intermediate care unit where Garrett Lund was being kept under a false name with 2 federal agents outside his door and a chest tube draining into a collection chamber that had been showing the wrong numbers for 18 hours. Sarah was already calculating. Power cut to the East Wing meant the intermediate care unit was running on emergency backup, which, in a facility that size, meant automated systems stayed up, ventilators stayed up, monitoring stayed up, but access controls on the wing's secondary entry points went to failsafe. Failsafe in most hospital security configurations meant doors defaulted to unlocked. It was a fire code requirement. It was also, for someone who knew hospital infrastructure and wanted access to a specific room without passing a staff security checkpoint, a clean solution. "How long ago?" she said. Falk was still on the phone. He held up 2 fingers. 2 minutes. She did the math on distance. Harlow, Utah was 112 miles from their current position. At speed, without traffic, an hour and 20 minutes. Maybe less. Not enough. "Get someone to that room," she said. "Right now, not in a few minutes." Falk spoke into the phone. She heard him give the room number. He had it memorized, which told her he'd been more invested in Lund's situation than he'd let on. He listened. His jaw tightened. "The agents outside his door are responding to the power cut," he said, lowering the phone slightly. "They went to check the corridor. They left the door. Standard protocol for a facility emergency is..." "Standard protocol," she said carefully, "is exactly what someone who planned this would count on." She looked at Morales, who had appeared in the doorway when the communications unit chirped. "I need a vehicle, and I need to leave now. You can come, or you can give me the keys." Morales looked at Falk. Falk said, "Go, that." Morales drove. She sat in the passenger seat with the secure phone Falk had handed her as she walked out, the line to St. Anselm's nursing station open, listening to the organized chaos of a hospital wing dealing with a partial power failure. She'd spent enough time in hospitals to parse the background noise, the elevated voices, the clipped intercom calls, the particular sound of wheels on linoleum moving at a pace that was faster than normal but not running, because running in a hospital meant something had already gone very wrong. "East Wing Intermediate Care," she said to the voice on the line. "Room 14. I need someone physically present at that door in the next 60 seconds. Ma'am, we're dealing with a facility emergency. I understand that. I need you to listen to me. There is a patient in room 14 who is under federal protection, and the power cut to your East Wing is not an accident. Please get someone to that room." A pause. Then a different voice, male, more alert. "This is Charge Nurse Walton. Who am I speaking with?" "My name is Sarah Voss. I'm a trauma nurse, and I'm traveling under federal authority to your facility right now. The patient in room 14, whatever name he's registered under, is in danger. His federal security detail left the corridor. I need someone physically in that doorway until they return or until I arrive." A silence that lasted about 4 seconds, which was 4 seconds of a person deciding whether to treat this as a crank call or a credible threat. "Hold on," Walton said. She held. Morales was doing 107 on a 2-lane highway in the dark. He was good at it. He kept both hands on the wheel and his eyes forward and didn't speak, which was exactly what she needed from him. Walton came back. "I've sent our security coordinator to East Wing Interim Care. He's moving now." "Thank you. Don't let anyone into that room except the federal agents who were posted there or law enforcement with verifiable credentials. Anyone else? Doctor, administrator, maintenance, anyone. Call me before you let them in." "Understood." A pause. "The patient. Is he in immediate danger?" She looked out at the dark road. "I don't know yet. That's why I need eyes on the room." She kept the line open. Morales drove. Ruger was in the back seat, pressed against the door, reading the tension in the vehicle the way he always did, ears forward. 8 minutes later, Walton came back on the line with a voice that had changed register. "The security coordinator is at room 14. Is the patient there?" "Yes, he's agitated. His monitoring is showing elevated heart rate." "Is there anyone else in the room?" "No, he's alone." A pause. "One of the federal agents is returning to the corridor now. The coordinator says the other agent is in the stairwell. Said he heard something." "Tell the coordinator to stay at the door," she said. "Do not let the second agent back into that room until I get there." A longer pause. Ma'am, that agent has credentials. I understand. Please do what I'm asking. I will take full responsibility. Do not let anyone into that room. Walton made a decision. Okay. She lowered the phone and looked at Morales. Faster. So, they arrived at St. Anselm Regional 54 minutes after leaving Merritt, which was a time Sarah didn't think about because thinking about it would mean thinking about what could have happened in 54 minutes, and that wasn't useful. What was useful was the layout of the building, which she'd pulled on Morales' phone during the drive. The East Wing entrance, the intermediate care unit on the second floor, the stairwell positions. The hospital's East Wing entrance had its access panel dark, door propped open by someone who'd left a door stopper in the gap, which told her the security coordinator had come down to let them in rather than wait for the access system to be restored. Smart. She went through and up the stairwell at a pace that was fast but controlled. She needed to be functional when she arrived, not breathing too hard to be useful. Second floor. The intermediate care unit had a nurse's station at the corridor entry and rooms along a single hall. Walton turned out to be a heavy-set man in his 50s with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and the look of someone who'd had a genuinely bad night and was managing it through professionalism. Room 14 is at the end, he said. Security coordinator is still there. The federal agent who went to the stairwell. He paused. He came back up about 5 minutes ago. He's in the corridor. He said there was nothing in the stairwell. She looked down the corridor. The agent in the corridor was a man she hadn't seen before, not one of Falk's core team she'd been in contact with. He was standing about 15 feet from room 14's door, arms loose, watching her approach with the professional neutrality of someone doing their job. He was the right age, the right build, the right kind of clothes. She looked at his shoes. It was a small thing. The wrong thing to notice, maybe. But she'd spent years reading people in the compressed time windows that emergency medicine allowed, and what she noticed was that his shoes were wet. Not damp, wet, like someone who'd walked through standing water or heavy wet grass in the last hour. The stairwell of a hospital that had been fully functional until 40 minutes ago would not have standing water. She stopped 6 feet from him and said, "Agent," and paused as if she was about to use his name and had momentarily lost it. He said, "Reese." She said, "But, right," and looked at Walton beside her and said, "Can you get Dr. Rice for me? I need a medical update on 14's current status." Walton moved toward the nurse's station. The moment he did, she looked back at the man who'd said his name was Reese, and she said, very quietly, "Who sent you?" He was good. The tell was small, a fractional change in his weight distribution, a shift that happened before his face could catch up and maintain the neutral expression. He said, "I was assigned to—" "Your shoes are wet," she said. "It's a dry night and there's no standing water in this building." She kept her voice low and very even. "The agent whose place you're standing in, where is he?" He moved faster than she expected, which told her he'd been waiting for the moment when he was made rather than trying to avoid it. He'd already accepted discovery as a possibility and had a plan for it. He went for the door of room 14. She was between him and it before he completed the first step, not because she was faster, she wasn't sure she was, but because she was already angled for it and he wasn't, and that geometry mattered. She didn't fight him for the door. She put herself against it with her back to the frame and her weight distributed, and she looked at him and she said one word, "Don't." What came next was 4 seconds of the specific calibrated standoff that happens when two people are both assessing the same variables simultaneously. The corridor, the nurse's station 20 feet away, the security coordinator behind the door, the noise a struggle would make, the consequences on each side of the decision. He made the wrong calculation. He grabbed her arm, the damaged shoulder, which told her it was targeted, and she went with the pain instead of against it, rotating into the grab rather than pulling away from it, and used his leverage and her own momentum to put him into the wall beside the door with his arm locked at an angle that wasn't going to work for him. She held it, and she said, close and quiet, "Lie down on the floor or I'm going to dislocate this. I've done it before, and I know exactly how hard to push." He went down. Morales was there 15 seconds later, breathing hard from the stairs. He saw the situation and had cuffs on before she'd fully stepped back. She was shaking slightly, Her shoulder was screaming. She pressed her back against the wall and breathed through it for a few seconds, which was all she allowed herself. And then she pushed off the wall and opened room 14. Garrett Lund was awake. He was also clearly in pain. She could see it in his posture, the careful shallowness of his breathing, the way he had both hands flat on the mattress as though steadying himself. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, with the kind of face that had been through more weather than most, and eyes that were alert in a way that the rest of him couldn't quite match. The chest tube was in place, the collection chamber showing numbers she looked at immediately and didn't love. Output was up, which matched what Rice had told her. The monitoring showed sinus tachycardia, rate around 102, which was elevated but not critical. His oxygen saturation was 93%. Low. Manageable. Not comfortable. She introduced herself simply. Sarah Voss. I'm the one who answered the phone. He looked at her for a moment, then he said, I know who you are. I looked you up when I found out your name was still in the record. His voice was rough, built around the careful breathing of someone managing around something that hurt. You look like you had a rough night too. Worse than usual. She came to the bedside, checked the tube placement with her eyes, secure, correct position, and looked at the monitoring. The man in the corridor, someone sent him. I know. I could hear something through the door when the power went out, voices moving around. He shifted slightly and couldn't suppress the involuntary tightening of his face. Your people? Morales has him. She pulled the chair from the corner and sat, which she needed to do because her shoulder was now a sustained, miserable presence rather than an intermittent one. Agent Falk is 20 minutes behind us. He has a federal court recorder coming to take your deposition. Lund was quiet for a moment. His eyes went to the collection chamber, which he'd clearly been watching himself. My lung isn't getting better. No. Dr. Rice told me this morning they might need to go back in. Possibly. She looked at him directly. If they do, your recovery window is going to complicate a legal process that needs to move fast. So if you're going to give that deposition, we should talk about what's in it before the recorder arrives, so you're not spending your energy on things Falk already has. He studied her. You want me to save my breath for the parts that matter? Yes. He breathed carefully. In, out. The intake logs from the Northeast Post, he said. Weeks 7 and 8. I personally processed the transfer request that moved those documents out of the field station archive. The request came with a routing code I'd never seen before. Not a standard protocol code. I flagged it internally and was told by my supervisor to process it anyway. Did you copy the transfer record? A pause. I photographed it. With a personal device I wasn't supposed to have on site. He looked at her. The photographs are on a memory card that has been in a safe deposit box in a bank in Provo, Utah for 2 years and 4 months. She stared at him. I know, he said. I should have given it to someone sooner. I was afraid. And then I was very afraid. And then someone hit me with a car. He paused. Fear has a way of making you wait too long. Does Falk know about the card? No, I was going to tell him when I trusted the secure channel enough. He looked at her steadily. I trust you. She understood the weight of that and didn't diminish it. When Falk arrives, I need you to tell him directly. The bank, the account, the access information. We need that card before the Verity consolidated records are served at 0600, because if those records are incomplete, if Darrow's people have touched them, the card is the backup. Understood. Garrett. She used his first name without thinking about it, which was a medical habit she'd never fully separated from the rest of herself. First names brought people back from the place they went when they were scared and in pain. The deposition. When you give it, tell them about the transfer. Tell them about the routing code. Tell them you photographed it. She paused. And tell them about the 23. He was very still. I know you were there, she said. Not gently, not harshly. Not during, but after. The cleanup operation is where the contractors got hurt. You were logistics, you were present. He looked at the ceiling for a long moment, then he looked back at her. I didn't know what it was when I was there. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't know the number. You know it now. Yes. He exhaled through his nose. I know it now. Then tell them all of it, she said. Everything you've been holding on to, because what you're carrying is the piece that makes everything else make sense. Falk arrived 19 minutes later with a federal court recorder, two additional agents whose chain of command he'd personally verified, and the controlled energy of a man who'd been awake for 22 hours and was running on whatever comes after the second wind. He saw Morales in the corridor with the man who'd called himself Reese zip-tied to the nurse's station support column, and he stopped for exactly 2 seconds to process that, and then he came into room 14. Lund's deposition took 41 minutes. Sarah stayed. Falk looked at her when the recorder set up, and she looked back at him without moving, and he decided not to argue. She sat in the corner with her shoulder braced against the wall, and she listened to Garrett Lund give his account in the careful, measured way of someone who had been composing it in his head for 2 years and was finally delivering it to the right room. He told them about the transfer, the routing code, the photographs, the safe deposit box in Provo. He told them about what he'd seen in the weeks after the event, the movement of personnel, the communication blackouts, the documents that moved through his processing station in volumes that were inconsistent with any legitimate operational closure. He told them the name he'd heard the routing code attributed to. The name came through the deposition recording and landed in the room with the specific weight of something that had been kept underwater for a long time and had finally surfaced. Philip Darrow. Not filtered through a subordinate signature, not routed through an intermediary authorization. The routing code that had moved the Northeast Post Medical Archive out of the federal system and into the hands of people who would remove specific pages and specific entries bore a classification prefix that was registered to one individual at the level of authorization required to generate it. Philip Darrow had personally ordered the removal of the documentation that connected him to the authorization of the operation and its subsequent cover-up, and Garrett Lund had a photograph of the transfer request with that routing code on it, sitting in a bank in Provo. When the deposition ended, Falk stepped into the corridor and made a call that lasted 4 minutes. When he came back in, he looked at Sarah and said, "The bank opens at 0900. I have federal authorization for emergency access. We'll have the card by 0930. And Verity Consolidated. Marshals are on site in Denver. They go in at 0600 as planned." He paused. "With the deposition and the card, even if Darrow's people have touched the Verity records, we have enough to establish what was there and what was removed." She nodded. Her shoulder was bad enough now that she was consciously managing her breathing around it, which was a sign she needed to stop ignoring it. She stood up. "I need someone to look at this," she said, meaning her shoulder. And she said it without embarrassment because there was no version of handling this effectively where she pushed the injury through another 12 hours without attention. Falk said, "Dr. Rice is on this floor." Dr. Rice turned out to be a compact, no-nonsense woman of about 40 who looked at Sarah's shoulder with the expression of a clinician cataloging exactly what kind of night this was. The posterior deltoid was worse than Sarah had assessed, significant hematoma, and what Rice suspected was a partial tear that the initial adrenaline had masked. She taped it, gave her a sling she would wear for approximately the next 4 hours before she found it too limiting and removed it, and looked at her and said, "You need imaging." "Tomorrow," Sarah said. Rice looked at her with the recognition of someone who understood that some patients were going to do what they were going to do regardless of medical advice, and shifted to making sure the management was as good as it could be under those conditions. She did a thorough job. Sarah appreciated it. At 0547, Falk's phone received confirmation that the federal marshals were in position outside the Verity Consolidated Services building in Denver. At 0601, they went in. The records request took 2 hours to fulfill, which was faster than Sarah had expected and slower than she'd hoped. Verity's legal team arrived at 0710 and immediately began attempting to narrow the scope of the seizure, which was the right legal move and also the move of people who understood what was in those records and were trying to limit exposure. The marshals had been briefed on the specific intake log designations they needed and held to that scope without negotiating. At 0849, a federal agent in Denver sent Falk a secure file transfer containing scanned images of 47 pages of intake logs from Verity Consolidated's compliance archive. Sarah was sitting in the corridor of St. Anselm's intermediate care unit when Falk brought the tablet over and sat beside her and opened the file. The logs were formatted in the standard field station intake structure: patient identifier, date, treating clinician, injury description, disposition. She scanned them the way she scanned a chart, fast and organized, looking for the entries she'd written. They were there, not complete. She could see the gaps, the injury description fields that should have had her notation and now showed only the patient identifier and the date. Someone had removed the clinical content but hadn't removed the entry itself, which was the mistake. The entry with her name as treating clinician and the date and the patient's identifier was still there. The content was gone, but the record of the record existed. And on the authorization header of the transfer request that had moved those specific logs into Verity's compliance archive, under a routing code she now recognized from Lund's deposition, was the authorization signature: Philip Darrow, in full. She looked at it for a long time. Then she handed the tablet back to Falk. "That's enough," she said. "Yes," he said. "It is." At 0931, a federal agent in Provo, Utah, accessed a safe deposit box at a bank on 400 South and retrieved a memory card in a small waterproof sleeve. The card contained 23 photographs. 14 of them were of the transfer request document Lund had described. The photographs were clear, time-stamped, and showed the routing code and authorization signature without ambiguity. Falk received confirmation of the card's contents at 0948. He sat down next to her again, and she could feel the shift in the situation, the particular change in atmospheric pressure when something that has been building for a very long time finally reaches the weight required to move. "We're filing today," he said. "I know." "The U.S. Attorney's Office has been briefed. They've been waiting for this for longer than we have." He paused. "Darrow is currently in Washington. He has a meeting this afternoon at a private club in Georgetown that we've had under surveillance for 3 weeks. He doesn't know yet." "No." Falk looked at the floor. "He thinks last night went badly for us. He thinks we lost the safe house and had to scramble and that our witness is deteriorating." He paused. "He thinks he's winning." She thought about that. About a man in Washington having lunch at a private club, comfortable in the long discipline of his covering operation, confident in his system, confident in his people in the right places. She thought about Bright, in custody, about the man who'd called himself Reese, zip-tied to a nurse's station column on the second floor of a Utah hospital, about Captain Roy Mercer, standing on her gravel road watching his officers hand over their phones, not yet understanding the size of what he'd been used for. "The filing," she said. "What does it include?" "Everything. Your statement, Lund's deposition, the Verity records, the photographs from the card, the communications intercepts from Bright's device." He paused. "The body camera footage from Officer Haas." She'd almost forgotten about Haas. She'd told Falk to pull that footage first the night of the raid, standing in her wrecked kitchen. It felt like a week ago. "What does it show?" "Everything that happened from the moment you opened the front door." Falk's voice was careful. "Including Mercer's knee. Including the timeline of the search. Including the fact that 3 other cameras had recording gaps and Haas's did not." He paused. "Mercer filed an incident report this morning claiming you resisted lawfully and that the force used was appropriate. The footage makes that report a criminal document." She absorbed that. "He filed this morning?" "At 700, before he knew what we had." She shook her head slightly. The particular exhaustion of watching someone dig deeper into a hole they'd built themselves. "The Haas footage," she said. "It's going into the federal filing?" "As an exhibit, along with the falsified report, which becomes evidence of obstruction and falsification of official documents." He looked at her. "Mercer is no longer a collateral issue. He's a co-exhibit." She sat with that. She didn't feel satisfaction exactly. It was more specific than satisfaction, and less clean. She felt the recognition of consequence meeting action, which was different from justice in the poetic sense, and was also more real. At 11:14, Warren Falk filed a federal criminal complaint against Philip Darrow, retired colonel, on charges including conspiracy, obstruction of justice, destruction of federal records, and accessory to what the filing termed unauthorized use of lethal force resulting in civilian deaths, 23 counts. She was in the corridor when Falk stepped out of the room, where he'd been on a call with the U.S. Attorney's Office and told her. She nodded. Then her phone rang. Unknown number, but the prefix was familiar. The same pattern as the call the night before. She answered. It wasn't Lund. Lund was 20 feet away in a hospital room. The voice was male, older than Darrow, and very calm. Ms. Voss, it said, my name is not something I'll give you over the phone, but I want you to know that what was filed this morning, what you helped build, is going to create a very significant problem. Not for Colonel Darrow. A pause. For you. She looked at Falk. He was watching her face. Philip Darrow is not the top of the chain, the voice said. He never was. He was a very useful layer, and the people above that layer have considerably more resources than he does. Another pause. The filing has already been flagged. The judge assigned to this case was assigned deliberately, and the evidence you believe is in federal custody this morning is going to face a legal challenge by end of day that you are not prepared for. She said, Who are you? Someone who has watched 3 prior attempts to expose this operation fail, the voice said. I want this to be different, which is why I'm calling you and not anyone else. A pause. There is a sealed deposition from 2019 sitting in a federal court archive in Virginia. It was filed by a contractor employee and immediately classified at a level that buried it. It names names that your current filing does not reach. He stopped. If that deposition surfaces, the legal challenge Darrow's people are about to file becomes irrelevant. But getting to it requires someone who can walk into a federal courthouse and make a specific request under a specific authority. She looked at Falk. You have that authority, the voice said. You were granted it as part of your separation agreement from the Army, a provision you were probably never told about because it was inserted into your paperwork by someone who was planning for exactly this moment. A pause. Check your separation documentation, Ms. Voss. Page 17, paragraph 4. The call ended. She lowered the phone. Falk was already asking what it was. She was already thinking about a folder she had in her go bag, the waterproof sleeve of documentation she carried everywhere, that she'd packed the first week after she'd separated from service and had never opened since because she'd been trying to leave that part of her life in the past where she'd put it. She unzipped the go bag, found the sleeve, opened it, counted to page 17. Paragraph 4 was 11 lines long, written in the specific, dense language of legal addenda, and buried inside it was a clause that she had never read because she had never read past page 12 of a separation agreement that she'd signed 3 years ago in a room she'd wanted to leave. She read it now. She read it twice. Then she looked at Falk, and she saw from his expression that whatever was on her face was telling him something significant before she'd said a single word. There's a deposition, she said. Sealed, 2019, Virginia Federal Archive. She looked at him steadily. And I have the standing to request its unsealing. Falk stared at her. Someone put it in my separation paperwork, she said. 3 years ago, someone who knew. He said very quietly, Who would have had access to your separation documentation at that level? She looked at the paragraph again, at the language, at the specific clause structure, which she now recognized as something she'd seen before in a different context. The context of someone who thought very far ahead, who built things in the spaces no one officially supervised, who was patient and disciplined. The clause had been inserted by someone inside the same apparatus that Philip Darrow served, but not someone who served it the same way. Someone who had been, for a very long time, waiting for the right person to read page 17. She didn't move for a full 10 seconds, just stood there in the corridor of a Utah hospital holding a document she'd signed 3 years ago in a room she'd wanted to leave, reading 11 lines that someone had buried inside her paperwork like a key placed under a rock, not hidden from her specifically, but hidden until she was ready to need it. Falk came and stood beside her and read it over her shoulder. She felt the moment he understood it because he went very still. Someone inside the apparatus, he said. Not a question. Yes? Someone who disagreed with what the apparatus was doing. Enough to plan for this. Years out. She looked at the paragraph again. The clause authorized the bearer, specifically her, by name and service number, to petition for unsealing of any classified deposition filed in federal court during her period of active service on grounds of direct material relevance to ongoing federal proceedings. It was narrow. It was precise. It had been written by someone who understood exactly how to make a legal instrument that looked like standard separation boilerplate until you needed it not to be. Whoever wrote this knew my name, knew my service record, knew I'd been at the Northeast Post. And believed you'd eventually surface, Falk said, as a witness. Or hoped I would. She folded the document carefully and put it back in the sleeve. I need to be in Virginia. We have a federal flight out of Salt Lake, 4 hours. Book it. She spent 40 minutes with Garrett Lund before she left. Not debrief, just time. He was being prepped for the surgical consultation Dr. Rice had recommended, which meant he was tired and medicated and not at his sharpest, but he was also, underneath all of it, lighter than he'd been when she'd arrived. She recognized the quality, the specific relief of someone who had been carrying something alone for so long that setting it down felt physically different. The deposition, he said. The sealed one. Did they tell you who filed it? No. He looked at her. I have a guess. She waited. There was a woman, administrative coordinator, Harmon Verity. She was at the Northeast Post for the final 2 weeks of the operational window. She saw more than I did because her clearance was higher and nobody watched what they said around her. He paused. Her name was Adele Marsh. She left the contractor system about 6 months after the operation closed. I lost track of her. Adele Marsh. She filed it. If she filed a deposition in 2019, Lund said, and someone classified it immediately, someone with enough reach to bury a federal court filing, then what she had was worse than what we have. He looked at the ceiling. Whatever is in that deposition is going to be bad, Sarah. I know. Are you ready for bad? She thought about her wrecked living room, the bruise on her collarbone that had gone yellow-green at the edges overnight, the shoulder in its sling that she'd already quietly resented for 6 hours, the 41 minutes of Garrett Lund's voice telling the truth into a recording device in a hospital room. I've been ready, she said. I just didn't know it yet. The federal courthouse in Alexandria, Virginia, was the kind of building that expressed institutional permanence through its architecture, columns, stone, the deliberate weight of a structure designed to communicate that what happened inside it mattered and would continue to matter. Sarah had been in enough briefing rooms and administrative buildings and forward operating bases to be genuinely unmoved by institutional architecture. But she stood on the front steps for a moment before she went in, because the shoulder was aching from the flight and she needed 30 seconds to reorganize herself, and because she understood that what happened in the next few hours was the kind of thing that didn't unhappen. Falk's team had called ahead. A federal magistrate named Howell had been briefed on the clause and its legal standing, and had spent 2 hours the previous evening consulting with the Office of the U.S. Attorney about whether the petition was viable. The answer, delivered at 700 the morning after Sarah's flight, was yes. The provision was unusual, but legally sound. The separation agreement had been filed with the Department of the Army and was on record. The clause was enforceable. The petition took 40 minutes to file. Another hour and 15 to process through the magistrate's review. Then Judge Howell signed the unsealing order. The deposition of Adele Marsh, filed under seal on March 14, 2019, was 46 pages long. Sarah read it in a small conference room with Falk across the table, and a federal attorney named Reyes beside her who was there to advise on the legal implications of each section as they went through it. She read it straight through without stopping. By page 12, she understood why it had been buried. By page 23, she understood why the voice on the phone had said that Darrow was never the top of the chain. By page 40, she had the name she hadn't had before. Not a colonel, not a contractor, not a logistics coordinator. An undersecretary. A civilian official who had authorized the original operation through a channel that bypassed the standard oversight structure, who had then directed Darrow to manage the aftermath, and who had spent the subsequent 7 years in positions of increasing institutional authority while the evidence of what he'd enabled sat sealed in a federal archive 40 minutes outside Washington. His name was Dennis Culver. He was currently the deputy director of a federal oversight committee that had been for the past 3 years responsible for investigating contractor misconduct in overseas operations. He had been, in other words, in charge of investigating himself. Reyes set down the page she was holding. She looked at Falk. She said, "We need the Attorney General's office. Today." What happened next moved faster than anything that had preceded it, because the legal machinery, once pointed at something with this much documented weight behind it, accelerated rather than slowed. That was the thing Sarah hadn't fully understood about evidence, that the hard part was building it. Once it existed in sufficient mass, the system that was designed to process it did. The U.S. Attorney's Office filed an expanded criminal complaint at 3:47 p.m. It named Philip Darrow and Dennis Culver as co-defendants. It incorporated the Verity Consolidated Records, the photographs from Lund's memory card, Lund's deposition, Sarah's sworn statement, the Marsh deposition, and communications intercepts that federal investigators had been accumulating for months while waiting for the evidentiary backbone that had now arrived. Darrow was arrested at 4:22 p.m. at the private club in Georgetown, where he'd been having a late lunch, which meant he was in his jacket and his good shoes when the federal agents came through the door. Witnesses said he didn't run. He stood up from the table and straightened his jacket and walked out with them, which was the gesture of a man who had spent 30 years believing he was too well constructed to fall. He was wrong, but he walked out like he didn't know that yet, which was somehow worse. Dennis Culver was arrested at his office in a federal building in Washington at 4:31 p.m. His assistant told reporters afterward that he'd been on the phone when the agents arrived and had asked to finish the call. They'd said no. Captain Roy Mercer of the Callaway Bluff, Wyoming Police Department was served with a formal notice of criminal investigation at 5:15 p.m. At the department he still believed he ran, for falsification of official documents, excessive use of force, and civil rights violations. He was suspended without pay pending the outcome. His badge and his weapon were collected by the county sheriff, who had the particular expression of someone performing an unpleasant task they had been quietly expecting for some time. Officer Haas's body camera footage was released as part of the public court filing at 6 p.m. It was on regional news by 6:30. It showed everything. The front door opening before anyone knocked, a woman in scrubs handing back a warrant and pointing out the address discrepancy in a calm voice, a police captain walking past her anyway, and then 8 minutes later, the same woman face down on her own floor with a knee in her back. By 8 p.m., it was national news. By 9 p.m., the caption underneath the footage was her name, her service record, and the words decorated combat medic and trauma nurse. She watched none of it in real time. She was sitting in the conference room in Alexandria when her phone began going off with a consistency that indicated something had broken open publicly. She silenced it. There were things she still needed to do that required her attention before she could afford the energy of processing what was happening outside the building. She finished the annotated review of the Marsh deposition with Reyes. She signed the supplemental statement that incorporated the additional material. She ate a sandwich that someone had brought in at some point and that she'd ignored for 2 hours, eating it now because her body had been running on reserve since the previous night, and there was a specific flatness that came when she'd pushed it too long. Falk came in at 9:45. He sat down. He looked tired in the way that people look tired when they've been carrying something for a long time, and it's been set down, but the body hasn't caught up yet. "It's done," he said. She looked at him. The expanded filing, the arrests, everything. He paused. The AG's office is calling it the most significant federal contractor abuse case in 14 years. He put a folder on the table. "This is for you." She opened it. A single page on Department of Justice letterhead, signed by the U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Virginia. It was a formal letter of complete exoneration. It stated that Sarah Voss had been the subject of a targeted effort to obstruct federal proceedings through the use of manufactured law enforcement actions. It confirmed that no criminal conduct of any kind had been established or was alleged against her. It described her cooperation as essential to the outcome of the proceedings. She read it once. Put it down. "I need you to know," Falk said quietly, "that you were the piece we couldn't build this without. Not because of what you witnessed, because you were the only person who could authenticate the records, petition for the Marsh deposition, and provide the connective tissue between 3 independent evidentiary sources." He paused. "I've been doing this for 19 years. I've never had a witness who did what you did." She thought about what to say to that. Thought about a quiet house on a gravel road and a dog named Ruger, and 12-hour shifts, and a life she'd built to be small enough that it wouldn't call attention to itself. Thought about the plan that had worked until the night someone pointed a police captain at her door, and she'd opened it before he could knock. "I wasn't trying to do anything exceptional," she said. "I was trying to survive the week." Falk looked at her for a moment. "I know," he said. "That's what made it work." But the legal proceedings that followed took months. That was the honest reality of it. The arrests in the late afternoon were the visible event, the dramatic one. But the actual work of the law was slow and procedural and involved a great deal of paper and an enormous number of hours in rooms that looked nothing like the ones in the movies. Philip Darrow's trial ran for 11 weeks. His defense attempted, methodically, to challenge each evidentiary thread in sequence. The Verity consolidated records were challenged on chain of custody grounds. The challenge failed. The Marsh deposition was challenged on classification grounds. That challenge failed in 4 days because the unsealing order had been signed by a federal magistrate under a legally sound provision, and there was no mechanism to rebury it. Darrow's attorneys argued that his authorization signatures indicated administrative oversight, not operational direction. The recordings Lund had provided, which Sarah learned about only during the trial, because Lund had not told her about the recordings until he'd given his full deposition to the prosecution, made that argument untenable. Lund had made recordings, not photographs, not just photographs. He'd recorded 3 conversations at the Northeast Post on a device nobody had searched him for because he was logistics, he was administrative, he was just the coordinator. He'd been carrying recordings for 2 years and 4 months in a safe deposit box in Provo alongside the photographs, and he'd told the prosecution because he'd been ready to tell them everything, finally, in that hospital room in Harlow. The recordings included Philip Darrow's voice, giving specific instructions about which documentation to remove, to whom, and why. The jury in the Darrow case deliberated for 9 hours. The verdict was guilty on all major counts. Dennis Culver's proceedings moved separately and more slowly, through the particular friction of prosecuting someone whose institutional position had given him 7 years of access to the same systems being used to prosecute him. But the Marsh deposition was specific, contemporaneous, and corroborated by the Darrow materials in ways that Culver's attorneys couldn't explain away. He entered a guilty plea 11 weeks after Darrow's verdict, likely calculating that a trial would be worse. He was correct. Darrow received multiple federal sentences to be served consecutively. He would not see the outside of a federal facility. Culver's sentence was shorter, which was the compromise of a plea agreement, and which Sarah understood was the reality of how these things worked, even as she found it insufficient in the specific human way that legal outcomes are often insufficient when measured against what was actually done. 23 people, 7 years of cover, 9 individuals dead or institutionalized. Insufficient was the right word, and it sat in her chest alongside the knowledge that this was what completion looked like in the real world. Not perfect, not clean, but real and documented and permanent. Roy Mercer lost his badge. He lost his pension, which the county stripped through a civil proceeding that followed the criminal charges like a second wave. He was convicted of falsification of official documents and civil rights violations and sentenced to 18 months, of which he would serve 11. He would not work in law enforcement again. She didn't feel triumphant about Mercer. She'd felt almost nothing about him for a long time, which she thought was probably the correct emotional response to a man who had been a tool rather than an architect. He'd done real damage to a real person in her real living room, and he would face real consequences. And that was what accountability looked like, stripped of drama. 8 months after the night a police captain knocked on a door she'd already opened, Sarah Voss drove back to Callaway Bluff. Not to stay. She'd broken her lease when everything became public, and Hargrove Memorial had offered to reinstate her position, but she'd said she needed time, which was honest. The town felt different now in the way that places feel different after you've been the center of a story that happened in them. Not bad exactly, just altered. She came back because she had a meeting. The Army had reached out 6 weeks after the verdicts through a channel that was formal and careful, with the specific carefulness of an institution that understood it had a debt and was trying to figure out how to pay it. The meeting was at a federal building in Cheyenne, which was close enough to Callaway Bluff that she'd driven up the day before and spent the night in the town she used to live in, having dinner alone at a diner she'd eaten at regularly, and it had felt like revisiting something that had already finished. Ruger had sat under the table. The waitress had given him water without being asked. That had been the best part of the evening. The meeting was brief and direct, which she appreciated. A colonel named Stafford, who had the look of someone who had read her entire file before the meeting and was seeing her three-dimensionally for the first time, offered her a position. Not a return to active service. She hadn't asked for that and didn't want it. A consulting role, working with military medical personnel on trauma protocol and field conditions. Training. The kind of work that required someone who had done it in circumstances that couldn't be replicated in a classroom. She said she needed a week to think about it. She took the week. She drove back through Wyoming in the early fall when the landscape was doing the thing it did in September. The light going amber and long, the ridge lines starting to turn. She ran in the mornings before dawn the way she always had, slower now because the shoulder was still in recovery, accepting the limitation because the alternative was making it permanent and she didn't want permanent limitations. She thought about the things she'd carried for 3 years and what it had cost her to carry them, and what it had cost Garrett Lund, and what it had cost the people who never got to carry anything because they'd been ended before they could. She thought about Adele Marsh, who had walked into a federal courthouse in 2019 with 46 pages of truth and had her testimony sealed before anyone could hear it, and who Sarah had never met and never would meet because Marsh had died in 2021 of a pulmonary embolism in an apartment in Tucson, quietly, with nobody watching. The deposition had been her attempt to put something permanent on the record before it was too late. She hadn't known if it would ever surface. It had surfaced. Sarah thought, the things that get buried aren't always destroyed. Sometimes they're just waiting. She called Colonel Stafford on a Thursday morning from her truck on a back road outside of Laramie, with the windows down and Ruger in the truck bed. "I'll take the position," she said, "with conditions." "What conditions?" "I work with the personnel directly, not through an administrative layer. If I see something that isn't working in their training protocol, I say so, and it gets addressed." She paused. "And I'm not a consultant who writes reports and disappears. I'm in the room." A brief pause. "Those are reasonable conditions." "I know," she said. She drove back through the amber light, and the landscape opened up the way it did out here. Wide and honest, not asking you to be anything in particular, just present. She'd chosen this state 3 years ago because it was quiet and it didn't expect much of her. That hadn't worked out the way she'd planned. She wasn't sure anymore that it had been the wrong outcome. She thought about what she would say to the first group of medics she stood in front of. Not a speech, not a lesson, something true. She thought, the person they will send you to treat is going to be scared and damaged, and sometimes the damage will be their own fault, and none of that matters once they are in front of you. Your job is the person in front of you. See them. Don't decide in advance what they're worth. She thought, you are going to be underestimated. By people you work with, by people you report to, by situations that don't look like the ones you trained for. The underestimation is not the problem. How you carry yourself inside it is. She didn't write any of it down. She didn't need to. She'd been carrying it for 3 years in the specific way she carried everything, precisely, without waste, waiting for the right room. She was almost ready for the room. On a Tuesday morning in October, Sarah Voss walked into a training facility outside of Fort Carson, Colorado, with a go bag on her shoulder and a dog she'd gotten permission to bring and a folder of curriculum materials she'd spent 2 weeks putting together. 12 military medics were waiting, sitting in a loose arrangement of chairs with the specific posture of people who'd been told this was important without being told exactly why. She set the folder on the table. She looked at the room. "My name is Sarah Voss," she said. "I did 3 combat deployments, I've spent 2 years in trauma ER, and I spent the last year reminding a few people that quiet doesn't mean weak." She paused. "We're going to work on what to do when everything goes wrong at once, which is most of the time. So, let's start." Nobody in that room knew the full story yet. They would, eventually. It was public record now, the kind that didn't go away. But that morning they knew her name, and they knew she was there, and they were listening. That was enough. That was more than enough. The person everyone dismissed had turned out to be the one who wouldn't stop. She hadn't done it to be recognized. She'd done it because the truth was the truth, regardless of who was watching, And because 23 people deserve to exist in the public record is more than a problem someone managed. She'd done it because a man had put her face down on her own floor and laughed, and the laugh had been wrong about her in every possible way. The room had never been the problem. She'd always been in the right one.